What happened to the police who had to call? All units. User under the nickname Iron Harbor. I was a junior officer at the time, barely 2 years out of the academy. The shift had been quiet, just a few noise complaints, a minor trespassing call, then the radio lit up. Dispatch told everyone to stand by. Then a frantic voice came over the channel, ordering every available unit to respond. I had never heard that particular phrase used with such urgency. Usually, they might say backup requested, but this time it was all units. The location was an old industrial complex on the edge of town, a place rumored to host shady gatherings. My partner and I floored the accelerator, adrenaline spiking. The scene looked like chaos. Flashing lights painted the rusted buildings in red and blue. We saw officers crouched behind their patrol cars, weapons out. The dispatch repeated, all units respond. I grabbed the radio asking for details. Someone yelled that there was a group of heavily armed suspects holed up inside, possibly with hostages. Our lieutenant barked orders. We formed a perimeter. Then I heard gunshots echoing from deep within the building. My heart pounded in my throat. This was not a standard day of duty. We advanced in a line protected by the SWAT team. I can still picture the interior. Broken concrete floors, old machinery, a labyrinth of corridors. The suspects fired sporadically. We took cover behind metal beams. Tension soared with every bullet that zinged past. Eventually, SWAT used tear gas, pushing us forward. I spotted 2 of the suspects fleeing through a side door. An officer near me tackled one, but the other turned and fired at us. The officer to my left took a bullet in the shoulder. Others pinned the shooter, disarmed him. We found crates of illegal firearms, bags stuffed with strange contents, some kind of potent narcotics, maybe. Word spread that another suspect tried to barricade himself deeper in, but eventually surrendered. The entire ordeal lasted hours. By dawn, we had a handful of injuries among officers, but no fatalities, thank God. The suspects, nearly a dozen in total, were placed under arrest. Later we learned they had a plan to distribute a wave of illegal arms across multiple states. Some had outstanding warrants for violent crimes. The reason they called in all units was because the initial responding officers were outnumbered and pinned down, and the threat level soared beyond typical backup needs. We used every resource, from negotiators to SWAT to K-9. It was terrifying but also a lesson in how quickly an operation can escalate. Standing there, listening to the lieutenant's urgent call, I realized the job could turn from calm to war zone in seconds. That day etched the phrase "all units respond" into my memory. Even now, whenever the radio crackles in that specific tone, I feel a chill, recalling the chaos in that old industrial complex where we nearly lost some of our own to a hail of gunfire. User under the nickname Nightscope. I was a detective, often behind a desk analyzing case files. So field action at 3 in the morning was not my usual routine. But the phone buzzed that night, telling me to get to the station immediately. Something big was happening. I arrived to a flurry of motion. Senior officers barked instructions, telling every available team to gear up. They said the city's southern district had descended into pandemonium. Multiple gangs decided to settle scores all at once, igniting a wave of violence across several blocks. Gunshots erupted from multiple hotspots, with terrified residents calling 911 from locked apartments. We had never faced a meltdown of such scale, so the chief made the unprecedented decision. Call every unit, every squad, every detective. I hurriedly donned a bulletproof vest, hopped into a battered old squad car with a patrol officer, and drove into the night of madness. The southern district roads glowed with scattered fires. Car alarms wailed. Some shops had smashed windows. Civilians crouched behind cars or barricaded inside. Sirens from all directions converged. We discovered multiple clusters of armed individuals prowling the streets, some exchanging gunfire with rival gangs. Officers grouped in lines behind cruisers, rifles drawn. The radio chatter was a frenzy. Each block had its own crisis, hostage situations, random shootouts, attempted lootings. Dispatch tried to coordinate, but the calls poured in too rapidly. We advanced block by block, dispersing or arresting gang members. The scariest part was how chaotic it felt, like we had dropped into a war zone. I saw muzzle flashes in the distance, heard screaming. The city's streetlights flickered, casting ominous shadows. We found a policeman wounded near an abandoned corner store, pinned by sniper-like shots from a rooftop. Another group eventually stormed that building, subdued the shooter. Helicopters buzzed overhead, shining spotlights on the chaos. Over the next few hours, we gradually pushed the violent factions back, seized caches of weapons, and rescued multiple bystanders. As dawn broke, battered squads regrouped, capturing the last pockets of resistance. The city fell eerily silent, the stench of smoke and fear lingering. We had never needed to deploy every single resource before, but that night demanded it. We ended up arresting dozens, though some got away. My memory of that operation is a swirl of sirens, shouted commands, gunshots echoing between buildings. Everyone in the department felt the tension, the weight of how close the city came to total meltdown. Even months later, the phrase "all units respond" triggers flashbacks of that neon-lit battlefield in the Southern District. Some colleagues left the force, too shaken by the memory of that savage night. As for me, I realized how fragile order can be. User under the nickname Stoniches. I was from a small-town department, so we rarely saw major crime. Petty theft, bar fights, maybe a domestic dispute. Then a traveling cult settled in the outskirts, occupying an abandoned farm property. At first, we overlooked them. They seemed quiet, until a terrified neighbor reported screams at night, bonfire rituals with masked figures. We tried a routine check, but they refused to let us onto the property, brandishing weapons. When our guys retreated to strategize, one of the cult members fired a shot in the air. That was enough to escalate. Our chief muttered that we did not have the manpower for a standoff. He called the state police, who recommended we bring all units, including support from neighboring counties. This was going to be a siege scenario. I recall the morning we assembled near the farm. Patrol cars, state trooper SUVs, a SWAT van from the nearest city. All told, maybe 50 officers for a cult rumored to have just a couple dozen members. But we had no clue about their arsenal. We set up roadblocks, used loudspeakers to demand they come out. The response was more gunfire from inside. No one was hit, but the message was clear: we were not welcome. Our SWAT team approached the main barn, braving a hail of bullets. Tear gas soared. Some cultists coughed, collapsed. Others emerged screaming about apocalypse. The scariest part was how fanatic they were, chanting that we were devils. A few tried to set a building ablaze with themselves inside, presumably a mass suicide attempt, but we cut off their route, forcibly subduing them. Then we discovered the basement of the house, where they kept people chained, presumably hostages or disobedient members. Rescuing those poor souls felt surreal. They were malnourished, battered, and we realized how close they might have come to a violent end if we had not intervened. Finally, after hours of standoff, we arrested the leaders, found bizarre relics, massive stores of illegal weapons possibly stolen. The entire property reeked of old blood and decay. We had never had to muster every single unit, but that day we saw why it was necessary. A handful of local officers alone would have been overrun or outgunned. I left that farm unsettled by the sheer fanaticism in those cult members' eyes, how they seemed prepared to kill or die. My peaceful town shattered that morning. The farmland turned into a war zone of yelling, tear gas, and desperate pleas from hostages. Even now, the farmland lies abandoned again, rumored to be haunted by the echoes of chanting. Whenever people ask me about my darkest day on the force, I speak of that cult raid, where we had to gather all units from multiple counties just to quell a group of armed zealots who believed the end times had arrived. User under the nickname Delta Range. I used to serve in a metro police force, assigned to a specialized narcotics division. One night, an undercover operation to bust a large-scale drug ring went horribly awry. Our team had arranged a sting in a shipping warehouse. The suspects arrived, outnumbering us. They realized we were cops and unleashed a barrage of automatic fire. Our undercover guys barely scrambled behind cargo containers. The radio erupted with urgent calls. All available units, respond to the warehouse. My partner and I raced there. En route, we heard frantic updates. Multiple officers pinned down, at least one critically wounded. Reinforcements poured in from Traffic Patrol, K9, even the mounted unit off duty. Everyone converged at the warehouse. The first sight was a battered police van riddled with bullet holes, engine smoking. The suspects were entrenched behind forklift pallets, using machine guns and shotguns. We took cover behind thick steel crates. The muzzle flashes lit the interior like a strobe. Our SWAT team came in from the rear, coordinating a pincer move. Still, the suspects fought hard, presumably protecting a massive stash of cocaine and possibly money. The firefight felt endless. I recall the smell of gunpowder, the screams of an officer hit in the leg, me dragging him to safer ground. We eventually deployed flashbangs, then tear gas. The suspects coughed, losing aim. One by one, they either tried to escape or surrendered. Some kept firing until they ran out of ammo. By the end, we had 4 officers wounded, none fatally. About 9 suspects were arrested, 2 dead. The entire place looked like a war movie set, bullet casings scattered, stacked crates splintered by gunfire. Seeing every arm of the department in one place was surreal, from traffic cops leveling shotguns to SWAT in full gear, to plainclothes detectives with handguns. Everyone working in tandem to survive that hailstorm. That day taught me how quickly criminals can escalate, how essential it is for an entire department to respond with overwhelming force. The media sensationalized it, calling it a warehouse war. Our captain said it was the largest single bust that year, netting millions in illicit substances. But all I remember is the pounding in my ears, the fear that we might lose more officers. The phrase "all units" had never rung so loudly in my mind. Even years later, the echo of that night lingers each time I pass a shipping warehouse, reminding me how close we came to an even greater tragedy. User under the nickname Arrowshade. I was not a cop but a paramedic who often arrived alongside police at major incidents. One memorable night, the radio screeched about an active shooter at a college campus. The dispatcher repeated "all units, all units." My ambulance partner and I sped there, lights flashing. Campus security had locked some buildings, but the attacker was on the move. It was chaotic, students running in every direction, frantic 911 calls from multiple buildings. The police presence ballooned within minutes, every available squad car from half the county. They established a command post, forming small groups to sweep each building. We paramedics hung back until they declared areas safe. Then we rushed in to treat the wounded. The tension was suffocating. I recall a panicked voice on the police channel. Shots fired in the library, multiple down. My heart pounded. We prepared for mass casualties. Officers hustled inside, eventually neutralizing the shooter. By the time we got clearance to enter, we found a scene of heartbreak. Some injured, some worse. Police assisted us in dragging victims out. The entire campus was on lockdown, officers with rifles at every door. Helicopters circled overhead. That show of force, every unit responding, was the only way to corner the gunmen swiftly. If they had trickled in slowly, who knows how many more would have been shot. For me, the horrifying memory is the echo of sobbing in the corridors, the flicker of red and blue lights bouncing off trophy cases and bulletin boards. A place of learning turned into a war zone. Some students pressed themselves against walls, eyes haunted by the violence that had just erupted. I tried to keep calm while treating a young man with a gunshot wound to the arm, an officer kneeling to help me. The sense of unity in that moment was overshadowed by tragedy. Without all units responding, the shooter might have roamed longer. That day taught me how crucial it is for every resource to flood in when the threat is dire. People often complain about seeing so many squad cars at an incident, but in a scenario like that, it can save lives. User under the nickname Emberchase. I was a rookie patrolling a rural stretch of highway, expecting a quiet shift. Then dispatch crackled. A stolen 18-wheeler loaded with flammable materials, driving recklessly near our county line, refusing to stop. The voice over the radio commanded all units to converge. I sped out to intercept. Other officers did the same. We formed a blockade near an intersection, hoping to stop or slow the massive truck. But it barreled through, nearly toppling a cruiser. We gave chase, lights and sirens wailing. The driver, presumably desperate, started weaving across lanes, threatening to crash into any vehicle in sight. That was when the watch commander repeated, "All units respond." We needed spikes, more blockades, possibly an aerial unit. Over 30 squad cars from multiple jurisdictions ended up trailing this runaway truck. The risk was immense, because the trailer allegedly contained hazardous chemicals. One spark in a collision could create an inferno. The tension soared as the truck took an off-ramp into a smaller road, plowing through farmland fences. Officers scrambled to keep up, not letting it vanish. A helicopter arrived overhead, shining a spotlight. Finally, a skilled trooper managed to get ahead, lay down spike strips. The truck's tires blew out, forcing it to skid. We braced for an explosion, but the driver somehow maintained some control until he lost all traction, slamming into a ditch. We rushed in, guns drawn, fearful of a fiery outcome. The driver emerged with hands raised, babbling about needing money, that he had no choice. We took him down, placed him in cuffs, then carefully inspected the trailer. It was indeed loaded with dangerous chemicals, but luckily nothing ruptured. The entire chase spanned multiple counties, requiring every available unit to block roads, push civilian traffic out of harm's way, coordinate a safe takedown. That day taught me the raw intensity of a multi-agency pursuit. People saw the news footage of an army of flashing lights behind a single truck and questioned it. But if you knew the stakes, you'd see why we needed every last patrol car out there. User under the nickname Wolf Talon. I served in a large coastal city known for rowdy nightlife. We got a call about a riot on the boardwalk. Initially, just a few officers responded, but the crowd turned violent, bottles thrown, someone brandishing a firearm, fights erupting all at once. Dispatch said every unit in the vicinity needed to converge. By the time I arrived, the wooden planks were littered with broken glass. People shrieked and ran, or formed tight groups chanting. The ringleaders were obviously drunk or enraged, hurling random items at the few cops on scene. More officers ran in from the main street. We formed a line with riot shields, but the crowd pressed forward. The radio repeated, "All units respond," multiple times. Another wave of patrol cars screeched up. Officers jumped out wearing protective gear. The chaos lasted for hours. We used tear gas, and some in the crowd used fireworks against us, launching bright bursts dangerously close. My shield vibrated with each impact. The boardwalk that day felt like a battleground. Tourists hid behind carnival booths. Eventually, the riot control squads herded the crowd down to the sandy beach, cornering them, making arrests. I remember an officer next to me bleeding from a cut over his eye, caused by a flying can. The crowd, some chanting slogans, others just raging, refused to disperse until well past midnight. The entire fiasco seemed unstoppable at times, but wave after wave of responding units finally smothered the unrest. Reflecting on that experience, I see how a routine disturbance can mushroom into a full-scale riot, forcing the department to ring every alarm. The memory of that night's swirling lights on the ocean water, the stench of tear gas, the screams and clangs still makes me shudder. Sometimes it's not a single criminal or a dramatic hostage situation, but a boiling crowd that demands the call. User under the nickname Embervale. I was working as a K9 handler in a county known for random illegal gatherings in remote wooded areas. One summer evening, we received reports of a possible mass dogfighting ring operating near an abandoned cabin. Our cruelty task force attempted to investigate, but they stumbled onto a far larger, more dangerous operation. They faced armed men who threatened them. The call went out. All units, including the K9 teams, respond. The tension in the dispatch voice told me we were up against more than dogfighting. We arrived to see multiple men running into the woods, and from the scattered cages, we discovered savage dogfights were only one part. They were also trafficking stolen firearms. The area lit up with spotlights from arriving squads. A perimeter formed. I took my dog into the dense trees, searching for suspects who fled. We found them armed, desperate, obviously ready to shoot. They fired a warning shot overhead. My fellow K9 handler unleashed her dog to circle from behind. The suspects tried to outrun us, but the dogs cornered them against a creek. We ordered them to drop weapons. Another suspect emerged from the darkness, Nearly shooting an officer had my dog not barked, alerting us. It was a tangle of fear, howls, flashlights flickering among pines. Eventually we pinned them down, seized multiple crates of firearms, along with battered dogs that had been forced to fight. The worst sight was a small clearing splattered with blood, ringed by makeshift fences. Our entire department, plus neighboring counties, had to come. That was how big it got. We ended up arresting nearly 20 people. The images from that night still haunt me. The panicked dogs, the suspects' gunshots echoing, officers streaming in from every direction. The radio repeating all units as though we were at war with a criminal fortress. That day reaffirmed the power of cooperation across every branch of law enforcement when we confronted cruelty and violence at once. User under the nickname Coast Glimmer. I used to be a beach patrol officer, typically dealing with drunks or lost kids. One afternoon, a frantic call erupted. An armed suspect had hijacked a speedboat and was heading out to sea with a hostage. The local Marine unit was short-staffed, so the call for all units extended to everyone with any watercraft or relevant skill. Sheriffs, city police, even volunteer rescue teams. I ended up on a patrol boat racing out to intercept. Helicopters joined overhead. We found the suspect's boat a few miles offshore. The suspect threatened to shoot the hostage and demanded safe passage to some unknown location. The standoff turned into a multi-hour negotiation on open water, with choppy waves rocking our boat. Every so often, the suspect fired a shot in the air, making it clear how on edge he was. We tried various maneuvers from a distance, not wanting to spook him. The hostage was visible on deck, crouched. Time passed. A SWAT sniper arrived on a larger police vessel. The day wore on, the sun beating down. In the end, as twilight fell, the suspect's boat engine sputtered, possibly out of fuel. He freaked out, brandishing his weapon, but the sniper found an opening, wounding him with a single shot. We rushed in to secure him, rescue the hostage. The entire fiasco might have ended differently if we had not mustered an entire force, from water units to air support. That phrase, all units, ringed in my head as we dashed across waves. Grateful the suspect had not decided to shoot the hostage or sink the boat in a final act of desperation. I never anticipated being part of a seaborne standoff, but that is the nature of policing. Sometimes you respond to calls beyond imagination, requiring every last resource. Seeing the relief on the hostage's face after we hauled them aboard was a moment I'll never forget. User under the nickname Crimson Trace. I was a homicide detective for years in a major city. One night, multiple calls exploded across the city, indicating a series of armed robberies happening nearly simultaneously at various convenience stores. Our data suggested a coordinated group hitting places in quick succession. Patrol units tried to respond, but each new robbery call overlapped the last. The suspects were heavily armed, allegedly wearing tactical vests. The chief snapped and declared all units on high alert. The radio turned chaotic as we mapped out which stores had been hit. We realized the gang was moving in a loose spiral pattern. We set up intercept squads at potential targets. Eventually, at a small corner market, we cornered them. Shots were fired. The suspects split in different directions. Some took hostages inside the store, others hijacked a car in the parking lot. Our SWAT plus every free officer had to converge. That store became the epicenter of a tense negotiation. Meanwhile, additional suspects, who had not joined that final robbery, roamed free, presumably heading for another store. The chief orchestrated a massive net. He assigned teams to the store standoff. Others roamed the streets searching for the second group. By the end of the night, nearly every officer in the department was on the clock, patrolling, responding, or blocking roads. The standoff concluded with the suspects releasing the hostages and trying to flee out the back. We caught them amid a hail of bullets. Fortunately, no hostages harmed, though an officer took a wound to his leg. The second group was cornered soon after, thanks to a wave of squad cars saturating every block. We rarely see such broad mobilization, but that spree forced us to mobilize the entire city's law enforcement. Later, analyzing how well or poorly we coordinated taught us vital lessons in multi-target response. But in that moment, seeing the store swarmed by lights, hearing the battered voices of dispatch repeating all units, hammered home the reality that criminals can plan to exploit typical response times. Only by calling the entire force could we seal off those possibilities and bring them down. User under the nickname Baron Sky. I was part of a specialized city riot control division. The moment that demanded every unit in the city was a protest-turned riot outside the courthouse, triggered by a high-profile case. Tensions were sky-high. We expected a crowd, but not tens of thousands. The protest started peacefully. Then a small radical group began smashing windows, overturning cars, setting fire to trash bins. The crowd panicked or joined in. Soon the entire downtown square was in chaos, with random pockets of violence. The command center realized we needed full mobilization. SWAT, K-9, mounted police, neighboring cities' reinforcements. The air thickened with tear gas. We formed shield walls, pushing the crowd back from the courthouse steps. They hurled rocks, some brandished homemade weapons. I spent hours behind a riot shield, my arms aching, ears ringing from the roar of the crowd. Police lines advanced and retreated like a tide. The sky grew dark, lit by the glow of burning debris. Only a massive presence of uniformed officers, from every corner of the city, prevented them from storming the building. By midnight, arrests piled up. Paramedics rushed in to treat the injured, both civilians and officers. The phrase "all units" rarely echoed in our city before that day. But once the protest devolved into full riot, there was no other choice. Even then, we barely contained it. Some store owners hammered boards over shattered windows. Others said it looked like the city was under siege. It took the entire night for the chaos to subside, leaving behind smoldering wreckage and a battered sense of safety. My limbs shook for days after. I realized that no matter how well we plan, a mass riot can push us to the brink, forcing every officer to line the streets. That memory is carved deep. Crowds chanting, flames dancing. The repeated radio calls for every available unit, every single resource, until the city's collective might overcame the bedlam. These are the stories from various people claiming law enforcement or related backgrounds, all converging on moments when their department was forced to call in every possible unit. From large-scale gunfights in warehouses to raging riots on city streets, from cult showdowns to multi-location shootouts, each scenario pressed the entire law enforcement network to its limit. Each personal account underscores the raw tension of hearing that urgent phrase, "all units respond," and the knowledge that they are stepping into a powder keg with no guarantee of emerging unscathed. It is a testament to the unpredictability of their profession, that a single day can flip from routine to catastrophic, demanding the united force of an entire department or multiple agencies. That is what it looks like when the call for help stretches beyond standard backup, summoning the full weight of law enforcement in a desperate push to restore order against overwhelming odds.